Hello everyone, welcome to Landis Performance. Today I want to show you some tricks on rebuilding your 10 bolt, 12 bolt, or basically any hypoid rear differential. Each style will have different ways of making the adjustments, but overall it's all the same theories. So first off, let's start off with some of the tools you'll need. You'll need a bearing splitter, a T-bar to pull the bearing splitter to change your bearings. You'll need a press or a piece of tubing where you can beat on it to knock the bearings back on. Some micrometers, dial indicator. If you want to get really fancy, you can use a Pinion depth gauge like this from T&D Machine. One of the things I like to do is if the rear end was already together and it was quiet, is take the old pinion, press off the bearing, and find out which shim you had in the unit. Then you can take a micrometer and measure the thickness of the pinion head in a couple different spots and get an average of the thickness. Then you can take your new pinion gear from your new ring and pinion set and do the same thing. Measure with a micrometer in a couple spots and get the average. And then what you could do is figure out the difference of the two and either add or subtract a shim to make up the difference. And that's a really good starting spot. Another thing I like to do is I like to put this in the lathe, but you can clamp it in a vise and do the same thing, and take emery cloth and clean this section and this section of the pinion stem. And the reason I like doing that is these bearings press on with about a 2 or 3 thou press fit, and they're kind of hard to get off and on. So if you make a mistake with your shim thickness and you have to take the pinion bearing back off with them being polished and some of that crush relieved, it's a lot easier to get it off without damaging the bearings. So like I said, I always like to clamp these in the vise or in the lathe, and take some emery and just take a little bit of material off, put a nice polish on that, and it makes it just a lot easier to get those on and off. Now you can sand them till the bearings push on by hand. That's a little excessive. It will work like that. The only thing you have to worry about is the race spinning on the shaft instead of the bearings spinning. So if you get it the fitment like that, then what I would probably do is do a little red Loctite on there when you put it on for the final time, and then you'll be good to go. Another thing, these are crush sleeves, and this is what creates the pressure between these two bearings to make them ride in a race. So what I would usually do is use the old crush while I'm doing my test fitting till I get everything where I want it. Then I will install the new crush, which actually has to be load setted, so that way, because you only basically get one shot at these. And to check to make sure your clearance is right, you can take a inch-pound torque wrench and put it on the nut and spin it with just the pinion head in there, and you'll see your drag should have about 30 inch-pounds of drag. But there's differences whether it's new or old bearings or anything, but new bearings 30 thousandths crush. Another thing, when you're doing a ring and pinion, you should always get a master kit, because the master kit's going to come with these adjustable carrier shims and also give you a stack of extra pinion shims. And they should give you some marking compound so you can paste the gears in. Now, if you don't have any of these tools, you can still do a ring and pinion install. It just takes a lot more work and effort, because now the only way you can tell if it's correct or not is by putting it all together, pasting the gears, and then reading the paste. And then at that point, you'll have to decipher what the paste is showing you on the pinion and the ring gear, and then make the adjustment. So that's a very time-consuming way to do it. If you're going to do one gear set, then maybe that might be the way you want to go. If you're going to do a couple gear sets and maybe help out some friends and other people, then maybe you'd want to invest in some of these tools. The bearing splitter is very inexpensive. You can buy those at Harbor Freight. This happens to be a Snap-on because I use them a lot. But you can get one at Harbor Freight. Dial indicator you can get at Harbor Freight, or any tool trucks, Maco, Max, Snap-on. On the micrometer and a caliper. So you can read the pinion shims with a caliper. The only problem I found is you have your little thumb wheel and you can crush it and you can kind of change the readings because you're only talking about 1 and 2 thousandths on these shims difference. So it's hard to really get a really accurate reading on those. So that's why I prefer using a micrometer. The micrometer has a clutch on the end, and so you're always going to get repeatability on reading your shims. And then what I would normally do is I would normally take a Sharpie and write the numbers on the shims. That way I can spread them out on the bench and I can look at them and tell what thicknesses I have and stuff like that. As far as putting bearings back on this stuff, you need to make sure it's pressed all the way in. Also, with the races that go inside the case, they may be kind of hard to get into, but you've got to press these all the way in. If you leave a thou or two clearance on the backside, after you get the rear end together and start driving around, these will slowly move into seat, and now everything's loose and you've just ruined a set of ring and pinion. Now there are bearing race installers. Those are great to have, and those really work good at putting these in. You can hear when it bottoms out and when it's solid. So that's pretty much the overall on what we're doing. Now you'll see there's a number on there. This one, 2-inch 463. Now this one is a stock gear, so there's no number on this. But what that number is relating to is it's your pinion depth. So that's a measurement that they came up with on a machine to the center line of the axle or carrier to the back of the gear. That's what that number is. It's called a checking distance. And so that tells you mathematically using one of these tools exactly how deep it is. So with a tool like this, you install your pinion. You know the carrier depth is 2.463, so then you use this tool to mathematically get it exactly the way it is. If you're doing multiple rear ends, this is a well worthwhile tool to buy. This one is from T&D Machine Products. There's other manufacturers out there that sell them, but that's a really good way to go. Now, when you're doing the paste, you're going to see the way the patterns are. So if you're doing the paste method, or when you're finished and you want to verify where you're at, this is what you would use. And these patterns are showing you what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Good thing that Yukon does is they give you a setup sheet, and it tells you torque specs, pinion preload, like I said, we're using an inch-pound meter, so you can see how much preload's on the bearings. And they also give you a starting point for shims. And in the back, they give you some information about break-in and patterns and all that stuff. And there's a handy little sheet in here about assembly, what to do, stuff like that. With a pinion depth tool like T&D, you can see that this sheet is made for a lot of rear ends, 10 bolt, 12 bolt, corporate 10s, 7.5, Dana 30, 35, 44, 60, 9-inch, 488, 8 3/4 Chrysler, 75 to 64 BOP, and 8-bolt AMC. The way it works, there's a calibration tool to zero your dial indicator in. And then you set it up in the rear end of the car with a magnet stop, and you get a reading, and then you subtract it from your depth. And they have different adapters that go where the carrier bearing goes. That's how it locks in place. And again, they're showing you the manufacturer's housing distance, and then from there you can come up with your own numbers. So we have a carrier with no Pinion with no number on it. We can go to a 10 bolt 8.2, which this one is, and we see the manufacturer housing depth is 4.175. So we can take our reading with our micrometer and read this in a couple different positions, get the average depth, and then subtract it from the 4.175, and that will give you what your checking distance should be. And at least that way you've got a way of getting a great starting point. Then you can pace the gears, see what they come up with, and then go on to finishing the installation. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and press this bearing off, and then we'll read it, and we'll look at the new one and see what they are. All right, so now we have our Pinion with the bearing pressed off. There's the shim that was under the Pinion. So we'll take a micrometer and measure it, the thickness, 48 thousandths. So this is where it's good to have a pad and paper. So shim is reading 0.48. So then we want to read the Pinion head. So we'll take our micrometer. So that's 685, 1 inch 685. That's 1 inch 687. That's 1 inch 686. Now the reason we want to read it in a couple different reasons is because this is not a machine surface here. So let's just call it 1 inch 686. Now we'll measure the new Pinion head. That's 1 inch 714. 1 inch 714. 1 inch 714. So typically what we would do is figure out the difference between the two and then add that shim in. But on some occasions with a production Pinion, because it's not a machine surface back here, you cannot do that. Especially since our shim is already 0.48. And we go to our book. For this rear end, they're calling for a 30,000 shim as being the standard. So if both Pinion heads were aftermarket, that cross measurement would probably work. In this instance, it did not work. So now what we'll do is we'll go by the OEM spec here, which is a 30,000 shim. We'll put a 30 in it, and then we'll see where that places us. So now we'll go ahead and polish this stem so that the bearings go on and off easy, since we're probably going to have to be changing it a few times. So here I clamped the Pinion splines in the vise of the lathe, and I'm spinning it and emery clothing the bearing surfaces. I start out with 220, move up to 320, finish up with 500. The whole idea of this is to allow the bearings to be pressed on and off easily. And here's the final product. Okay, so now we have our Pinion polished, which will make the bearings go on and off easier, being that we're going to have to change a couple times. So now we want to take our shim pack that came in the master build kit, and we want to get a marker and mark the sizes on them. We want to make sure there's none stuck together. All right, so that one's a 20. That's a 12. Another 12. It's a 17. And that one's a 10. All right, so since we looked and saw that the nominal OEM shim for this rear end should be a 30, we're going to take a 20 and a 10, stick them together, take the pinion and press that on. And then we'll go to our differential housing, install our races, and then we'll get our first look at the measurements. All right, so here's a trick that I'm going to tell everybody. If you look at the bearing with a straight edge, you'll see that pushing down on it, you're pushing on the cage, not the race itself. So if you put this in a press, use a punch and try to work this down on here, what you'll end up doing is stretching the cage out and the bearing will fall apart, and then that bearing is no good. So here's a trick that I do. Take a pair of strong end cutters, and at the roller, I cut the cage. And at 180, I do the same thing. Then take a rag, because the bearings are going to go everywhere. Now you can use the old race, the old bearing, as your pusher. That will go in and push on the center race of the bearing and not touch the cage, so you won't ruin it. Just a trick that I learned years ago, because a lot of times when you're installing a ring and pinion, without having to buy a whole nother bearing kit, or if you have to run into the parts store, they won't have this one bearing in a separate piece. So if you ruin it, you're gonna have to buy another master kit or wait a week or so to get a replacement single bearing. So with this trick, you don't have to worry about that. You'll always press the bearing and never hurt the cage. So now you can see that the old race is there, the cage is free, and we're pressing in, and because we've polished everything, it's going together pretty freaking easy. You always want to put a little load on there. You make sure you have a good crush on that. Make sure those shims aren't loose in there. All right, so now we need to put the races in the housing. This is the rear pinion bearing, and this is the outer pinion bearing. Now, you can use a kit like this, what I like to use, because you can get all the way inside the housing with this tool, because it's got the extra reach for getting down inside to drive this one all the way home. Now, for whatever reason, this kit does not have the proper piece for this. How these work is they have a taper and a seat. So that goes down inside the race, so it pushes on this outer lip. It doesn't push on the inside where the bearing rides. Unfortunately, in this kit, I don't have the one for this. This is an oddball size. So what we'll do instead of that, because sometimes you don't have the right tools, we measure the OD of the bearing, the race, and we find a socket that's close. That one will get it most of the way in, and then this one will get it all the way in. So we'll use a socket to drive this one home. It's not the right way, but it will work. Just have to be extra careful not to get the race cocked and get it all the way seated. So we'll go ahead and put these races in, and then we can put our pinion in, and then drop the carrier and see where we're at with our paste. Go ahead and knock this in. Now that's all the way home. now they're in. I lost the video of putting the pinion into the case, but what I did was use the original crush sleeve, left the pinion seal out, and installed the pinion, torqued the nut until we received 25 inch-pounds of rotation, then proceeded to put the pinion depth gauge in the case. Alright, so there's the pinion depth tool in there, and use a magnet as your target. As we read dial indicator there, and that's giving us a target depth reading. So with the magnet and everything set up the way we are, the gauge is reading 0.917. So the tool zeroes at 3.375. And this is our target tool. Kind of hard to see on there, but it does say 3.375. So you put that on the dial indicator, and it's got an adjusted fixed target. You zero it out. That's what when the dial indicator reads 0, that's the number. So we write our number here at 916. We got to do some old school math here. So that's 6. That makes that 15. So that's a 9. 1 from 6 is 5. Make that a 13. That's a 4. And carry to 2. So that gives us a depth number of 2.459. And our carrier depth on the ring, on the pinion head, was 2.463. So we are sticking up approximately 4 thousandths. So to make this perfect, we would take the pinion back out and pull 4 thousandths out of the shim. Remember, we went off the chart and they said 30 is the nominal reading, so it put us really close. So we'll go ahead and do that now. We're going to pull the pinion out. Again, this is why we polished the shafts, so that we could get the pinion bearing on and off easily. But now we'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll get our reading, and then we'll continue on. So there, you read that there, we now have 912. So that puts us exactly where the pinion center depth is, for 2.463. So if you add 0.912 to that, it'll come out to the 3.375, which is our target measurer. So now we'll go ahead and do one of two things. We could go ahead and just put the seal in, put the final crush washer in, and finish it, or we could put the carrier in now and paste the gear, verify that we are 100% right, and then blow it apart and do the final assembly. So I think we're going to go ahead and put the carrier in and paste it first, just to verify that all the numbers are making sense, and then we'll go from there. So next we put the carrier in. I want to add something about Loctite. So all you need to do, put a nice dab on it like that, and then blow on it. And you get a nice coverage on your threads. That's all the Loctite that's required. I pull rear ends apart a lot where there's so much Loctite, it's in between the bolt and the carrier and the ring gear. It's not needed. All you need is just that little dampness on clean, dry threads, and it won't come out ever. This is always fun when the rear end is sitting like this, because it wants to take your fingers off. So now we gotta get the races moved over. So we can get our shim packs in. As you notice, it won't go in because we've got preload on it. So you gotta kind of trick it a little bit. Get it to come up a little bit. kind of get it all to work together going in. Typically when it goes together like that, that's usually a pretty good indication preload shimming is all right. Unfortunately, there's not a real good way of measuring that. Maybe you could make a long shaft and try to turn this and get a angle on it from there, but it needs to have preload on it, and without a spreader bar, it's hard to get it for sure. So now we're going to go ahead and torque these down. That little gun will make about 70 foot-pounds of torque, so I would consider that torqued in pretty good. So now there's our backlash. Still might be a little bit too loose. So we'll put our dial indicator back on. You gotta hold the pinion so it doesn't move. Okay, we still got a solid 20 there. So 7 thousandths obviously wasn't enough. So now we repeat the process. All right, so after making a couple of shim adjustments, I think we're pretty close now. We'll put our dial indicator on. All right, so that's a pretty solid 9.5. They're calling for 10 to be the nominal backlash. So we're pretty good here. I think we're good. So now we'll go ahead and paste the gears and see what the pattern looks like. So let me get the paste. So you want to paste both sides of the gear. This is actually the coast side of the gear. In other words, when the car is coasting, this is the side of the gear that actually makes contact. And then we also, more importantly, we want to see the drive side. The drive side is this side, or the back side of the gear, but that's actually where it rides for driving. Get a nice coat on there. We don't want it too thick because it makes it harder to get a pattern out of it, but we want it enough on there that you're going to see a pattern. So it's kind of a trial and error on there. Looks like we got pretty good coverage. Now what we'll do is try to put a load on the ring gear. Let's go ahead and do the coast first. All right, so there's our marks on our paste. And if you look at these two, it's very similar to those, which is an acceptable range. And also notice that this ring gear has got silver spots on already, so this is an already running rear end gear set. So a lot of times you're not going to get a perfect pattern because it depends on whether the pattern was good before. Another thing is you can see here that that's a mark that the paste left on other gears. So when you get it thick, you can kind of see that also and get your pattern. You can see on the coast side, it all looks real good. So you can get a pattern like that. The backlash is correct. You have a good completed third member. Okay, now that we have our paste good and the gear is set up right, we got our backlash. Now we got to blow it back apart to put the seal and stuff in. So we want to zip off the gear. Now again, because we polished everything, it comes right apart. You don't have to beat it apart. So now we will discard the used crush sleeve and put in the new one. We'll use a new nut. So now we're all set here. We'll put the seal in. And a couple things you want to do first. You want to put your seal on your yoke. Make sure that it's tight, that it fits good. We want to make sure that this area here is clean so the seal has something to ride on. Now another trick that I like to do, one, is I like to put a little bit of grease on the inside of this lip here, because this seal is going to be, metal is going to be spinning and it's going to create heat. So if you put a little grease there, it'll lubricate the seal and keep it from wearing out prematurely. The other thing, since you have to beat the spring in, I like to pack this side of the seal with grease, because there's a spring here, and when you're knocking the seal in, sometimes that spring can jump out. But if you pack that spring and seal part with grease, that'll hold it together while you knock it together, while you put it together. So that's what we're going to do now. Okay, so quick run through the parts cleaner and a little emery cloth. We got the seal, the yoke pretty cleaned up. It's not 100%, but it should work. And as you can see, we got some grease in the lip of the seal, and we got some grease packed around the wheel bearing, around the spring of the seal. So now we'll go ahead and install it. I like to use the wheel bearing race installer to do that. Just like that. So now, with the new crush sleeve, we can stick this in. One other thing we want to do, so another trick I like to do is where the splines are, oil can seep through the spline. So I like to put a dab of silicone around there when I install the washer, so that makes a seal there also. So we'll put a nice bead on there. Like that. Now that's ready to go. And we have our new nut here. Yes, and our new nut. Again, because we polished the shaft, it goes right back together. You don't have to beat it. Just gotta get everything lined up. Again, it's much easier when it's in the car because gravity is helping it hold together. Put the washer on with the silicone down and install our new nut. Oh, that's a different size. Okay, so now the nut is tight, but you see we still have end play because the crush washer has not been crushed. So now the thing to do now is you have to hold the yoke from turning and then tighten the pinion nut. Now there's a couple ways of doing that. Here's a couple old school ways you can do it with tools in the shop. You can use a monkey wrench or adjustable pipe wrench and then tighten it down. Big pair of channel locks if you have a big pair of those. Same thing, and on these you can actually put a pipe on this to get some more leverage. Or the old standby, the old adjustable wrench. Actually this one won't even fit this one, so there's a good reason why about that. Now, because I do a lot of rear ends, I actually have a plate that bolts on that you can put a 3/4 inch ratchet on. So let's put that on. And at this point, there are two different ways you can set the crush sleeve. One is with a crush sleeve like this where you tighten it down and that sets the load. So with this style crush sleeve, you actually tighten it down and it crushes. Problem with these are you can't back off. If you go too far, you have to throw it away and start over again. Or if you have some really thin shims, you can do that. The other thing, if you're going into a race car or something that's going to make some serious horsepower, so let's say 600 horsepower or more, they make solid spacers that are just a piece of tubing machined, and then they give you a stack of washers and then shims, and then you just keep changing the shim pack until you get the right preload. Like we talked earlier, 30 inch-pounds of rotational load. Now when you do a crush washer, you have to just snug it down. It takes a lot of effort, but you don't want to torque it. But when using a solid pinion shim, and that usually gets torqued to 250 foot-pounds because you don't want it backing off because there's no way of chasing that on. If you are reusing the nut up here, you have to put Loctite on there to get it to stay tight. So this was a new nut, we don't need Loctite. I'm gonna put my flange on here and we'll go ahead and set the preload. All right, so to tighten up the crush sleeve, or if you have the solid bushing in to torque the yoke bolt, the pinion bolt tight, you have to be able to hold the yoke. So I showed you a couple of different tools. This is what I use. Anybody with a plasma cutter or even a drill and a drill press could make one of these. This one's universal. It fits multiple different pinion flanges, and then you can put a 3/4 1/2 inch breaker bar in there to tighten it down. So we're going to go ahead and put this on. And all it does is lines up with 2 holes in there. So like I said, you can make yourself one of these very easily. And you wouldn't have to use a breaker bar. You can always just weld a piece of pipe to it, as long as I would probably make it, 3 or 4 feet long, because to get it to torque to 250 foot-pounds for the spacer, or even to get the crush started, it takes quite a bit of tightening. So you need something that's got some pretty good leverage. Okay, but as you can see, we still got end play here, so this crush isn't even started to get crushed yet. So what I use is I get this breaker bar. And we got the socket. Of course, it's a lot easier when it's in the car. All right, that might be close there. No, we still got play. All right, let's see where we're at now. Okay, so now we got all the end play out. So now we're going to work on our drag. Still feels pretty soft there. So where we take our inch-pound wrench and see how much load we have. Okay, so right there we're only getting about 5 inch-pounds of drag, so we need to go a little bit tighter yet. Now it's going to be a little bit closer. You're not going to take quite as much to make that adjustment. I know from doing it, it's going to take a little more than that. All right, let's try that. All right, there we go. We have 25 foot-pounds of load there. So now that's finished. Now we'll go ahead and put the carrier back in for the final time. All right, so now we have everything back where it was. Backlash is the same. We can go ahead and check it. And that's it. Put the cover on, fill it with grease, and ship it. So hopefully this was, you got to see how to do this. And if you have any questions about any of the stuff that I did or any of the tools, leave them in the comments. And I hope you enjoyed this. Remember, all this stuff is going to be the same no matter what type of rear end you do. Sometimes the adjustments are a little different. 9-inch has spanners here. Some of the Danas have a spanner. There's one that you can put a shaft in with a nut, so you can adjust the preload that way. Some of the Danas, the shims go behind the bearings. So again, you want to make those polished so the bearings come on and off on the carrier. But that's basically it. This thing's ready to go. So thanks for watching. Remember, subscribe, hit the like button, leave comments, share the video with your friends. And remember, Tuesday Night Live, we go live Tuesday night, 6 o'clock p.m. We can talk about all kinds of different automotive questions and answers and technical aspects of any of the stuff that we see on the channel. So thanks a lot. See ya.